"She's blind, not invisible," the girl said, her voice trembling, but loud enough to silence the entire room. The soft hum of conversation and clinking silverware filled the upscale Manhattan restaurant, golden light reflecting off polished glass and pristine white plates, the kind of place where people wore confidence like a second skin, where every seat cost more than Emily Carter made in an entire shift, and yet there she stood, in a simple black and white waitress uniform, her shoes worn at the edges, her fingers still shaking from carrying too many trays, staring at a moment no one else seemed willing to acknowledge, because right in the center of it all, near table 12, a frail woman stood frozen, her hand hovering uncertainly in the air, her dark glasses hiding eyes that could no longer see, her cane slightly tilted as if searching for ground that refused to answer, while a sharply dressed customer sighed in irritation, brushing past her with a muttered complaint about people like this ruining the atmosphere, and for a second, just a second, Emily hesitated, her manager's voice echoing in her head about not interfering with VIP guests, about keeping things smooth, quiet, profitable, but then she saw the woman's fingers tighten, just barely, like she was bracing herself against a world that kept moving without her, and something in Emily snapped into place, something stronger than fear, stronger than rent due in 3 days or the warning she got last week about stepping out of line, and before she could stop herself, she stepped forward, setting her tray down with a soft clink, her heartbeat loud in her ears as she reached out gently, carefully, her voice softer now but steady. "It's okay, I've got you," and the woman turned slightly toward her voice, her shoulders easing just a fraction as Emily guided her hand to the back of a chair, pulling it out slowly, making sure every movement was deliberate, respectful, like it mattered, like she mattered, and for the first time since the moment began, the tension in the room shifted. Not gone, not even close, but noticed, as if people suddenly realized there was a story unfolding right in front of them. One they hadn't paid for but couldn't look away from, and Emily crouched slightly, adjusting the woman's position so she could sit comfortably, her fingers brushing against a worn scarf draped loosely around the woman's shoulders, the fabric thin, out of place in a room filled with tailored suits and silk dresses, and without thinking, Emily reached up and gently straightened it, tucking it closer around her neck, a small gesture, almost invisible. But the woman's hand rose suddenly, finding Emily's wrist with surprising precision, holding it there just long enough to make Emily freeze, her breath catching, and then the woman spoke, her voice quiet, warm, carrying something deeper than gratitude. "You remind me of someone who used to believe kindness still mattered," and Emily swallowed, unsure what to say, her chest tightening as she offered a small smile the woman couldn't see. "It still does," she whispered, though part of her wasn't sure if she was trying to convince the woman, or herself, and somewhere above them, from behind the glass railing of the private dining level, a man in a tailored navy suit stopped mid-step, his gaze fixed on the scene below, his expression unreadable, his phone forgotten in his hand as he watched the girl no one else noticed choose to care when it cost her something, when it risked everything, and for the first time that night, the story had already begun to change. Emily straightened slowly, her knees aching from the long hours, but she did not pull her hand away right away. Not until she felt the woman's grip loosen on its own, like trust being returned instead of taken, and for a moment the noise of the restaurant crept back in, the low conversations, the faint clatter of glassware, but it felt different now, thinner somehow, as if something invisible had shifted beneath it all, and Emily forced herself back into motion because standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering that she was already on thin ice, that her manager had warned her twice this week about unnecessary involvement, that rent was due in 72 hours and her savings were down to less than $40, and yet when she reached for her order pad, she did not ask the woman what she wanted right away. Instead she softened her voice, leaning just slightly closer so she would not have to raise it. "Can I bring you something warm to drink, maybe tea or coffee?" And the woman smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from memory more than sight. "Tea would be lovely," she said, and Emily nodded even though the woman could not see it, writing it down out of habit. Her handwriting quick but careful, each letter pressed with intention as if details mattered more when no one else was paying attention, and when she turned toward the kitchen, she could already feel eyes on her back, not curious this time, not neutral, but sharp, measuring, and she did not have to look to know who it was. "Emily," the voice cut through the air before she even reached the counter, low but edged with irritation, and she paused, inhaling once before turning to face him. Her manager standing with his arms crossed, tie perfectly straight. Expression anything but, "What exactly are you doing?" he asked, his tone controlled in that way that always felt worse than yelling, and Emily kept her voice steady, even if her fingers tightened slightly around her notepad. Helping a customer, she replied, simple, honest, and for a split second, she hoped that would be enough, but his eyes flicked past her toward the table, then back, narrowing just slightly. That table is not assigned to you, and we do not provide complimentary service. Unless it is approved, he said, each word clipped, rehearsed, as if kindness required permission in a place like this, and Emily swallowed, choosing her next words carefully because one wrong step could cost her everything. She seemed lost. I just wanted to make sure she was okay, and there it was again, that brief pause, that calculation behind his gaze, not about right or wrong, but about cost, reputation, control, and then he sighed, adjusting his cuff like the conversation itself inconvenienced him. Make sure she orders something. We are not running a charity, he said before turning away, already done with her, and Emily stood there for half a second longer than she should have, the words settling heavier than they should have, because she knew what he meant, and she knew what he did not say. And still, when she walked into the kitchen, she did not just pour hot water into a cup and call it a day. She added a slice of lemon, a touch of honey, small things that did not show up on a receipt but made a difference you could feel. And when she carried the tray back out, she moved a little slower this time, not from hesitation but from intention, placing the cup gently into the woman's hands, guiding her fingers around it so she could feel the warmth safely, and the woman let out a soft breath, almost like relief. You did not have to do all this, she murmured, and Emily smiled again, the kind that barely reached her lips but stayed in her voice. I know, she said quietly, and above them, behind the glass, the man in the navy suit had not moved, his gaze still fixed, not on the room, not on the service, but on the girl who kept choosing kindness even when every rule around her said not to. Emily stepped back just enough to give the woman space, but not enough to disappear, because something about the way she held the cup, carefully, almost reverently, made it feel like leaving would be the same as abandoning, and she was not that kind of person, not even here, not even now. Is there anything else you might need? Emily asked softly, her voice steady despite the pressure building behind her ribs, and the woman tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond the words. Just a little company, if that is not too much trouble, she replied, and for a second Emily hesitated again, not because she did not want to stay, but because she knew what it would cost. Every extra minute away from her assigned tables meant slower service, fewer tips, more eyes watching, more reasons for her manager to step in again, and yet she pulled the chair across from the woman just an inch closer, not fully sitting, just enough to lean in. I can stay for a minute, she said. And the woman smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup as if memorizing it. That is more than most people would offer, she murmured, and Emily felt that one land deeper than she expected, because she knew it was true. She had seen it every day, people walking past each other like obstacles instead of human beings, measuring worth in dollars and time, and before she could respond, the woman spoke again, quieter now. What is your name? And Emily answered without thinking, Emily, and the woman nodded slowly, repeating it under her breath like it mattered. Emily, that is a kind name, she said, and Emily let out a small breath, almost a laugh but softer. I try to live up to it, she replied, though she was not sure she always succeeded. And above them, the man in the navy suit shifted slightly for the first time, his fingers tightening around the railing as he watched the interaction unfold, not missing the way Emily stayed when she did not have to, the way she listened instead of rushing, the way she treated his mother like she was still part of the world, not separate from it. And something in his expression changed, something sharper, more focused, like a decision forming quietly beneath the surface, while down below, Emily glanced toward the front of the restaurant as the door opened briefly, a gust of cold air slipping inside, reminding her how late it was getting, how long her shift still had to go, and how little room she had left for mistakes. But when she looked back at the woman, she did not see inconvenience. She saw someone who had been left behind too many times already, and without making a show of it, Emily reached into her apron, pulling out a few folded bills, her tips from earlier in the evening, and slid them discreetly beneath the edge of the receipt holder, not announcing it, not drawing attention, just making sure that when the check came, it would not be a problem the woman had to face. And as she did, the woman's hand moved again, resting lightly over Emily's for just a moment. You do not have much, do you? She said gently, not accusing, just knowing. And Emily froze for half a heartbeat, surprised not by the question, but by how accurately it was asked, and then she smiled, small but real enough, she answered, because somehow, in that moment, it felt true, and above them, the man's gaze darkened with something deeper than curiosity now, something protective, something personal, as he finally turned away from the railing, already reaching for his phone, already setting something in motion that Emily could not yet see, not knowing that the quiet choice she had just made was about to change everything. Emily withdrew her hand slowly, as if breaking contact too quickly might undo something fragile that had just formed, and she rose back to her feet, smoothing the front of her apron out of habit more than necessity, her mind already trying to catch up with the reality of the moment, the ticking clock in her head louder now, reminding her of the other tables waiting, the orders stacking up, the expectation she was already falling behind on. And yet her gaze lingered on the woman for just a second longer before she turned away, promising softly, "I will check on you again soon," and the woman nodded, her expression calm, almost knowing, as if she had already seen more than most people ever would without needing her eyes at all, and as Emily stepped back into the rhythm of the restaurant, the contrast hit harder than before, the polished laughter, the quiet deals being made over expensive wine, the subtle glances exchanged between people who measured value in ways she had never been part of, and she moved quickly now, picking up trays, delivering plates, apologizing for delays that were not entirely her fault, her feet aching with every step but her pace never slowing, because slowing down meant falling behind, and falling behind meant consequences she could not afford, not tonight, not this week, not with everything already so close to slipping, and just as she set down a dish at table 9, she felt it again. That shift in the air, the kind that came right before something went wrong, and she did not even need to turn to know her manager was behind her this time. "Closer, more deliberate, Emily," he said again, but there was no patience left in his tone now, only control sharpened into something colder, and she turned, keeping her posture straight even as her stomach tightened. "Yes," she answered. And his eyes moved briefly toward the woman's table before locking back onto hers. "The check has been flagged," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "It shows a discrepancy." And for a moment Emily did not understand, her mind still moving between orders and responsibilities, until the meaning landed, heavy and immediate, and her fingers instinctively brushed against her apron where the remaining bills rested. "Not enough to fix anything if this went the way she feared. I covered part of it," she admitted quietly, choosing honesty because there was no version of this where she could pretend otherwise, and his expression did not change, not even slightly. "That is not your decision to make," he replied, each word precise, controlled, final, and Emily felt the weight of every eye that might turn if his voice rose, every whisper that could follow, every judgment that had nothing to do with what was right and everything to do with what was expected, and still she held her ground. Even if it was only by an inch, she needed help, she said, her voice softer now but steady, and for a brief second something flickered in his gaze, not empathy, but calculation again, the kind that always came before a line was drawn. "Then you should have asked," he said, straightening his tie once more, restoring the image he cared about more than the moment itself, "because right now, it looks like you are giving away service without authorization." And the word hung there, heavier than it should have been, because Emily knew what it implied, what it could become if pushed further, and her throat tightened as she glanced toward the woman, still sitting quietly, unaware of the storm forming just a few steps away, and above them, unseen by most, the man in the navy suit had already started moving, his stride purposeful now as he made his way down from the private level, his expression no longer distant, no longer observing, but decided, as if whatever line had just been crossed below had reached him too, and Emily, standing there with everything she had on the line, did not yet know that the next few moments would decide far more than just her job. Emily felt the moment stretch thin, like glass about to crack, her fingers tightening around the edge of her notepad as the weight of what he was implying settled fully into place, not just a warning now, but a decision waiting to be made, and she could feel it in the way the room seemed to quiet just slightly around them, not enough for anyone to hear the words, but enough for them to sense that something was off, that something was shifting, and she drew in a slow breath, steadying herself because there was no safe answer. Here, no version of this where she walked away untouched. "I understand," she said carefully, even though part of her did not really, because to her it had never been about policy or permission, it had been about a person who needed help, and the man in front of her gave a short nod, as if that should have been the end of it, as if understanding meant compliance, but then he reached toward the receipt holder, lifting it slightly, checking again, confirming what he already knew, and when he looked back at her, there was no hesitation left. "We cannot have staff making independent financial decisions on behalf of the restaurant," he said, his voice just loud enough now that the nearest table glanced over, curiosity flickering in their eyes, and Emily felt her pulse spike, not from fear alone, but from the realization that this was no longer private, that whatever happened next would not stay contained between them, and still, she did not look away, because looking away would mean surrendering something she was not ready to give up. Then take it out of my pay, she offered, the words coming out before she could second-guess them, simple, direct, the only solution she could think of that did not undo what she had already done, and for a brief second, the man seemed almost surprised, not by the offer itself, but by the certainty behind it, and then that surprise faded just as quickly, replaced by something firmer, colder. That is not how this works, he replied, setting the holder back down with quiet finality, and now more people were noticing, heads turning slightly, conversation softening, the ripple spreading outward in that subtle way it always did in places like this, where people pretended not to watch while watching everything, and Emily became aware of every detail at once, the tightness in her chest, the heat rising to her face, the faint tremble in her hand she could not fully control, and still she held her ground, even as the space around her seemed to shrink. She did nothing wrong, she said, softer now but clear, and the man exhaled slowly, as if he had reached the end of his patience. This is not about her, he said, and that was the moment something inside Emily shifted, small but undeniable, because to her, it had always been about her, about the woman sitting just a few feet away, trusting a stranger in a place that had not made room for her, and before she could respond, before she could decide whether to push further or step back, a new voice entered the space, calm, measured, carrying effortlessly without needing to rise. Actually, it said, cutting cleanly through the tension. It is exactly about her, and both Emily and the manager turned at the same time, the room around them following a half-second later, drawn by something in the tone alone, and there he was, the man from upstairs, now standing just a few steps away, his presence shifting the air in a way that could not be ignored, his suit immaculate, his expression composed but unreadable, and for a moment no one spoke, because everyone seemed to sense that whatever came next would not be ordinary, and Emily felt her breath catch, not because she knew who he was, but because something in the way he stood there, steady and certain, made it clear that this was no longer just her problem to carry. The manager blinked once, just once, as if recalibrating what he was seeing, because the man standing in front of him was not someone you ignored, not someone you dismissed, and yet the situation demanded control, demanded that he hold his ground. Sir, if you have a concern, I would be happy to discuss it privately, he said, his tone shifting instantly, smoother now, more polished. The sharp edge replaced with practiced professionalism, but the man did not move, did not lower his voice, did not soften his stance. I am already discussing it, he replied evenly, his gaze steady as it moved from the manager to Emily and then briefly to the woman seated at the table, his attention lingering there just a fraction longer, enough to make something unspoken feel undeniable, and Emily felt her breath catch again, not because of what was being said, but because of how it was being said, calm without hesitation, controlled without effort, like someone who did not need permission to be heard. And around them, the room had shifted completely now. Conversations fading into near silence, forks resting mid-air, eyes no longer pretending not to watch, because something about this moment refused to stay small, and the manager cleared his throat slightly, attempting to regain structure. There has been a misunderstanding regarding service policy, he began, careful, measured, but the man cut in before he could finish, not abruptly, but with a precision that made it clear he had already heard enough. No, he said, there has been a misunderstanding about values, and the words landed heavier than anything said so far, not loud, not aggressive, but impossible to ignore, and Emily felt something shift inside her again, a flicker of validation she had not expected, not here, not like this, and the manager's expression tightened just slightly, the kind of reaction that revealed more than it concealed. Our responsibility is to maintain a certain standard, he replied, choosing his words carefully, but the man's gaze did not waver, and she did, he said, nodding once toward Emily, better than anyone else in this room, and there it was, the line drawn clearly now, not just between two people, but between two ways of seeing the world, and Emily stood frozen in the middle of it, her heart racing, her thoughts struggling to catch up with what was unfolding, because this was no longer just about a bill or a policy or a shift that had gone wrong. This was something bigger, something she had never been part of before. And before anyone could respond, the woman at the table turned her head slightly toward the sound of the man's voice, her expression softening in a way that felt deeply familiar. Daniel, she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard, and the name seemed to ripple outward through the room, not because everyone recognized it, but because of the way it was spoken, with recognition, with certainty, and the man stepped closer then, his posture shifting just slightly, the controlled distance replaced by something more personal, more grounded. "I am here," he replied, his voice softer now, and Emily's eyes widened just a fraction as the pieces began to fall into place, not fully, not yet, but enough to understand that this moment, this entire situation, had been connected in ways she had not seen, and the manager's composure faltered for the first time, just a flicker, but enough, as his gaze moved quickly between the two of them, recalculating again, reassessing everything he thought he knew, and the room held its breath, waiting, because whatever came next would not just resolve the tension, it would redefine it entirely. The name settled into the air like a quiet shockwave, and even those who did not recognize it felt the shift, the kind that did not need explanation, because the way the man stood, the way the woman reached for him without hesitation, already told a story far bigger than anything that had happened moments before, and Emily felt her pulse quicken as she watched him step closer to the table, his attention no longer divided, no longer observing, but fully present. "You should have called me," he said gently, his voice carrying a warmth that had not been there before, and the woman smiled, her fingers lifting slightly until they found his sleeve, grounding herself in a way that spoke of familiarity, of trust built over years. "I wanted to see if the world still remembered how to be kind," she replied softly, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his expression, something deeper than control, something almost like regret, before it settled back into focus, and then he turned, not quickly, not dramatically, but with purpose, his gaze landing squarely on the manager, who now stood a little straighter, a little more careful, as if realizing too late that the situation had already moved beyond his control. "You said this was not about her," Daniel continued, his tone calm but unmistakably firm, "but everything that happened here started with how she was treated," and the manager opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to justify, but no words came out right away, because there was no version of this that could be reframed without losing something essential, and the silence stretched just long enough for the room to lean into it, every guest now fully invested, no longer pretending indifference, because this was no longer background noise, this was the center of everything, and Emily stood there, barely breathing, her mind racing to catch up with the realization unfolding in front of her, because the pieces were no longer scattered, they were locking into place, clear and undeniable, and the manager finally spoke, his voice measured but lacking the confidence it held before. "We were simply following protocol," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded smaller than they had moments ago, and Daniel's expression did not change. "Protocol," he repeated, almost thoughtfully, before his gaze shifted briefly toward Emily, then back again, "does not excuse ignoring someone in need," and the weight of that statement settled across the room, heavier than any raised voice could have been, and Emily felt something inside her chest loosen, not completely, not yet, but enough to recognize that she was no longer standing alone in this, that someone had stepped into the space she had been holding by herself, and the manager's posture faltered again, subtle but real, as the balance of the moment tipped further out of his reach, and then Daniel took one more step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the next words impossible to distance from. "The woman you dismissed," he said, his voice steady, unwavering, "is my mother," and this time, the reaction was not subtle, not contained, but immediate, visible in the way several people straightened, in the way whispers began to ripple across the room, in the way the air itself seemed to shift under the weight of the reveal, and Emily felt her breath catch again, sharper this time, as the full truth landed, not just as a realization, but as something that redefined everything that had come before, every glance, every word, every choice, and the manager's face drained of whatever certainty had been left, his composure cracking just enough to show the reality beneath it, because there was no protocol for this, no prepared response for the moment when the person you overlooked became the most important person in the room, and Daniel did not raise his voice, did not need to, because the silence that followed carried everything he intended to say, and in that silence, one thing became undeniably clear: this was no longer about defending a decision, it was about facing the consequences of it. The silence did not break all at once, it unraveled slowly, like a room realizing it had been holding its breath for too long, and Emily could feel it in the subtle movements around her, chairs shifting, glasses being set down a little too carefully, whispers starting and stopping as people tried to process what they had just heard, because this was no longer a quiet disagreement between a manager and a waitress. This was something public, something undeniable, and at the center of it stood Daniel, calm, composed, completely in control of a moment that had slipped from everyone else's hands, and the manager swallowed, his posture stiffening as he attempted to recover. "I was not aware," he began, but even he seemed to know how insufficient that sounded, how little it explained, and Daniel did not interrupt this time. He simply watched, allowing the weight of the moment to sit where it belonged, and when the manager finished, or rather, when he ran out of words, Daniel spoke again. His voice measured, deliberate. "Awareness is not the issue," he said, his gaze steady. "Respect is," and the distinction landed harder than anything before it, because it stripped away the excuse entirely, leaving only the truth behind it, and Emily felt it resonate in her chest, a quiet confirmation of everything she had felt but could not say, and the manager nodded quickly now, the shift in power unmistakable. "Of course, absolutely. We value all of our guests," he said, his tone eager, almost rushed, but the words felt hollow against what everyone had just witnessed, and Daniel let the silence stretch just long enough for that to be clear before he turned slightly, his attention returning to the woman at the table, his expression softening again in a way that did not reach anyone else. "Did they take care of you?" he asked gently, and she smiled, her hand finding his again with quiet certainty. "One person did," she replied, her head tilting slightly in Emily's direction, and for the first time since this began, all eyes shifted fully to her, not as background, not as staff, but as the reason any of this was happening at all, and Emily felt the heat rise to her face again, her heart pounding in a different rhythm now, not fear, not entirely, but something closer to disbelief, because she had not done anything extraordinary, not in her mind, just what felt right, and yet here it was, standing in front of her like something much larger than herself, and Daniel followed his mother's gesture, his gaze meeting Emily's fully for the first time, not from a distance, not from above, but directly, and there was something different in it now, something deliberate, something acknowledging. "You stayed," he said simply, and the words carried more weight than a longer speech ever could have, and Emily swallowed, unsure how to respond, because what could she say that would not sound small in comparison to everything unfolding around her? She needed someone. She answered quietly, the same truth she had held onto from the beginning, unchanged despite everything. And Daniel nodded once, as if that was exactly the answer he expected, and then he turned back to the manager, the softness gone, replaced again with clarity, effective immediately, he said, his voice calm but final. "She will not be working under these conditions anymore," and the statement hung in the air for a second, just long enough for its meaning to settle, before he added, "because she will not be working here at all," and this time, the reaction was immediate, a ripple of surprise moving through the room. But Emily's breath caught for a different reason entirely, because for a split second, it sounded like everything she had feared had just come true, like the ground beneath her had finally given way, and she stood there, frozen between relief and panic, not yet understanding that what felt like an ending was about to become something entirely different. For a brief, suspended second, Emily felt everything inside her drop, the words echoing louder than the room itself, because she had heard them before in different forms, in different tones, but always leading to the same outcome, loss, uncertainty, starting over from nothing, and her fingers instinctively curled slightly at her sides as if bracing for it, her mind already racing ahead to rent, to bills, to what came next. But then Daniel took a step closer, not toward the manager this time, but toward her, and the shift in direction alone was enough to pull her back from that edge. "You are right," he said, his voice steady, grounded. She needed someone, and Emily looked up, meeting his gaze fully now, searching for something in it, something that would tell her which direction this moment was about to take, and what she found there was not dismissal, not pity, but something far more certain, and then he continued, "And people like you do not belong in places that punish that." And the words landed differently, not like an ending, but like a door opening somewhere she had not even known existed, and the tension that had wrapped itself around her chest shifted, loosening just enough for her to breathe again, while around them the room remained still, watching, waiting, because no one wanted to miss what came next, and Daniel turned slightly, addressing not just the manager now, but the entire space, his voice carrying with quiet authority, "This restaurant operates under a group I acquired 6 months ago," he said, and the revelation moved through the crowd like a low wave, subtle but unmistakable, "and tonight made one thing very clear," he added, his gaze returning briefly to the manager. "Standards without humanity are not standards worth keeping, and the manager nodded quickly, too quickly, words forming but never quite landing, because there was nothing left to defend, and then Daniel faced Emily again. Closing the distance just enough to make the moment personal, unmistakably so. "I am offering you a position," he said, direct, without hesitation, "not as a server, but as part of a team that actually reflects the values you showed tonight," and Emily blinked, the meaning taking a second longer to settle than the words themselves, because this was not something she had prepared for, not something she had imagined, and for a moment all she could think about was how different her life might look. On the other side of a single yes, and she swallowed, her voice softer than before but steady. "I do not have experience outside this," she admitted, honest as she had been from the start, and Daniel nodded once, as if he had expected that answer too. "You have the only kind that cannot be trained," he replied, and something in that sentence broke through the last of her doubt, not completely, but enough to let possibility in, and beside him, Margaret reached out again, her hand finding Emily's. With the same quiet certainty as before, "Kindness is rare," she said gently. "Do not let anyone convince you it is a weakness," and Emily felt her throat tighten, not from fear this time, but from something closer to relief, to recognition, to the realization that what she had always held on to quietly had just been seen, fully, without being dismissed, and as she stood there, the noise of the restaurant slowly returning around them. Conversations restarting, tension dissolving into something lighter. She realized that nothing about this night had gone the way she expected, and yet somehow, it had led her exactly where she needed to be, and when she finally nodded, just once, the smallest movement carrying the weight of everything she had just chosen, Daniel allowed himself the faintest smile, not performative, not distant, but real, and for the first time since she walked into that room, Emily Carter did not feel like she was standing on the outside looking in. She felt like she had finally stepped into a life that had been waiting for her all along.